Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Oh, wait, you already said. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Daria Warner, and I will be a moderator for this panel today. I'm an artist and an educator working in sustainable art practices, and super honored to moderate this panel of this vivid educators, artists, composers as well. So today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023, and it is 9:30 a.m. And this panel is titled Inspired by a Changing Planet, Creating and Curating Art. So before we started, I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since their time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pony, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. And one of other things I'd like to mention before we start the panel is that we want to make sure so everybody get a chance to ask the questions. And so this is how we handle the Q&A. We will reserve the time at the end of the discussion for the Q&A. We are using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly, please, so we'll be able to read your questions and dedicate enough time for it. If you are a student, please note this is your question. Note this in your question on the card. And so when you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer who will bring it up to me. And I'll urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. If you have a specific questions for the specific panelist, also please mention this in your card as well. And now I would like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. And for more information, you can also find the bios online for them. So I would like to start with Erin Espeley. And Erin is an artist and a scientist who was trained actually at Cornell as a biologist. And then she decided to explore the New York City theater scene before she found her way into independent avant-garde filmmaking. I had a privilege to see one of her films last night at the screening event, and it was mind-blowing. So if you're interested, go into our website. Also, you can go to the bio page at the CWA to check more information about her. And she combines poetry, science, and environmental politics in her work and modern digital technologies within the videos that define the traditional knowledge categories. So our next speaker is Millie Chen. And Millie, I love this introduction that want to use her own words that I found on her website in her statement, that she has a commitment to social justice. The social justice drives her research and practice. In her own words, my visual, audio, and performative works are intended to interrupt habits of viewing. Materials, tools, and methodologies are contingent on the needs of the moment. But the core of my projects are social inquiry and the use of sensory modes of perception and generating knowledge. This is like really interesting and intriguing. And fun fact, Millie was my professor at the University at Buffalo, where she currently teaches an installation art class that I took, and it was pretty actually groundbreaking for my career. So our next speaker is Mia Mulvey, and Mia work explores the recording of time and climate change and the relationship with the remote landscapes through such forms as ancient trees and ice and geology. Mia has an opening next Thursday, actually, at BMoCA, and her work is titled Albedo. So if you have time to check it out, BMoCA is a Boulder Museum Contemporary Art on Thursday from 5 to 8. She's also going to the Arctic Circle next year on a 2-week expedition, which is really cool. I have people who went there, and that was really exciting. And so our speaker is not the last, but not the least, Jeffrey Nitch. Jeffrey he has a diverse career and as an award-winning composer, educator, and performer and administrator and also a thought leader in the arts entrepreneurship. And he also since arriving in Boulder, he has rebuilt the entrepreneurship center for music. And I wanted to just get to the point where Jeffrey has been working with a lot of award-winning composers and various artists as well. So without overdue, I want to start our panel. And what we would like to do is to start with the opening remarks from each of the panelists. Maybe we can start with Jeffrey.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So in my own creative life, I've been interested in the intersection between music and the natural world for a long time. I was a geology major before I was a music major. And so that goes back a long way. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I wrote a symphony for the Boulder Philharmonic about the geology of the Rocky Mountains, and perhaps some folks might remember that piece coming up on exactly 10 years ago. And we paired the performance of that with a whole range of community events around discussing the music, around discussing the geology behind the symphony. We partnered with Boulder Space and Mountain Parks to have these musical hikes where we went up into the foothills with little musical excerpts from the symphony and talked about the geology that we were looking at right there in front of us. And that was really a turning point for my creative life, because I began to realize that the arts had a real power behind them to engage people in the community about issues that have nothing to do with the art. That in this case about geology or about our local environment. And that got me really thinking about things in very different ways. Most recently, the expression of that has been a string quartet called For the Trees. And it was inspired by the story of a 1,000-year-old Douglas fir on Vancouver Island called Big Lonely Doug. And this tree stands in the middle of a mountainside that has been completely clear-cut. And somehow this tree survived, and that's a whole interesting story in and of itself, but for time's sake, I'll skip over it. And when I heard about this, I knew that I had to write a piece of music about it, and I knew that telling sort of Doug's story through his eyes could be a vehicle for engaging audiences around the issue of deforestation and its contribution to climate change. And so I really, for the first time, conceived a work of art that was hopefully going to have that community engagement piece built right into it from the very beginning. And we just returned last week from a tour of Colorado high schools where we took this piece around and talked with students about deforestation and climate change as part of the performing of this piece. And it was a lot of fun and a great success, and I think really made an impact. So that says a little bit something about my creative life right now, and I think I will pass it along then.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to be here this morning. Again, my name is Erin Espily, and I'm going to talk mostly about my filmmaking practice. I have a couple of different prongs to what I work on, from writing to curating and editing, but filmmaking is something that in particular climate change has affected the most, and so today I'll talk a bit about that. So my filmmaking practice started in more traditional documentaries and started to evolve and became more experimental as I learned more about the format, and as I was thinking too about the way that our planet was changing and the stories I felt like that needed to be told. And as we consider how people get their information these days, I'm always struck by how few forms people are exposed to. And so it's something that in my practice I really think a lot about. Okay, how can I find something that's a little more distinctive that might catch someone off guard or surprise them or make them think a little bit longer? So often we might scroll through something, see something, but does it stay with us? Do we remember it the next day? Do we remember it the next week? And so what actually stays with people the most? And for me, that's often the most mysterious things. So when I think about climate change and I think about visualizing climate change, it often comes down to people, I think, falling upon certain iconic images like a starving polar bear or melting ice or smokestacks that are spewing toxic gases. Right? We know those things. We have those things. We're inundated with those images, and they can be overwhelming and somewhat stultifying because there's maybe a feeling of what can I do, a feeling of immobility and inaction. And so that's not something that I'm interested in pursuing in my art. I feel like one of the jobs of an artist and also of a scientist is to ask questions and to experiment and to try new things. So I'll give you an example of one of my current pieces that's in an exhibit at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is a collaboration that I've been working on for the last couple of years with Dr. Jeff Cameron, who's in the biochemistry department here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he studies cyanobacteria. And when I learned about cyanobacteria and what he was thinking about in terms of his lab, I became really excited because cyanobacteria, in my mind, are some of the perfect model organisms for our contemporary climate crises. Cyanobacteria produced oxygen in the Great Oxygenation Event 4 billion years ago. They changed our atmosphere. In fact, they created a kind of toxic atmosphere. It was not toxic to us, but it was at the time. And so there's an incredible mirror there in terms of what we're doing to our atmosphere. Concomitant with that is the idea, too, that cyanobacteria sequester carbon dioxide and their byproduct is oxygen. So they're the perfect organisms for us right now in that they can hold in CO2 and produce more oxygen. So I began working with Jeff in his lab and making images of these cyanobacteria as they grow and they reproduce. And I wish I had images here that we could show you because a lot of us are visual artists and it helps. But I'll just tell you that they're incredibly beautiful, and the way they move takes you into a different space. It's sometimes meditative and contemplative, and then other times explosive when they are spewed off the side of the petri dish, so to speak. So they're really dynamic, and yet they're also creatures that we have not seen often and we don't think about. So for me, in the context of this panel, I'd like to put forward the idea of artists providing potentially spaces, places, musical landscapes, different experiences for people to have that will take them outside of themselves and give them longer lasting, memorable experiences that they can carry with them. And that I think is something that we need at this moment in time. Thanks, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Erin.
Great, thank you. I already feel threads that are passing through all of our works. So hi, thank you so much to the CWA for having me here. My name is Mia Mulvey. I'm a visual artist. I'm mostly known as a ceramic sculptor, but I work with lots of different materials. And materials are really important to me in their connection to the landscape. So I work with clay. I've been casting salts, working with paper and fiber materials, all kinds of different things. So my work is mostly tied to the recording of time. So I've been, over the past several years, working with exploring ancient trees, ice, geology, as Daria mentioned. And so I've been fortunate enough to kind of travel around looking for locations where, trees are 8,000 years old, 9,000 years old, 3,000. So it's kind of a personal quest. I'm very interested in the idea of wonder, so my curiosity leads me. And wonder is not kind of a static emotion, but really an active space that's on your way to finding out. So I'm constantly learning and investigating, speaking with scientists. I am not a scientist myself. I like to pretend to be one sometimes, because that's what really fuels my practice. I'm very interested in facts and a certain amount of realism. So when I'm able to travel, I do utilize a lot of digital technology. So I do a lot of photogrammetry, which is a type of high-tech, low-tech 3D scanning, so that I can sculpturally record the environment without really having an impact on it. And so I can bring that back to the studio and, play with scale and work more three-dimensionally. So some recent projects at the Arvada Center recently with Aaron, there was an exhibit, Art and Science, and so I did a body of work around dendrochronology. And so last spring I was able to travel to the University of Arizona and kind of learn more from the scientists and researchers there, digging deeper into dendrochronology. At first it was more, just this emotional response to trees and the age, and now I'm getting more into the science and recording of climate change on much larger time scales than, my human one. And I'm interested in looking at that relationship between my little slice on the planet in the universe and kind of a much bigger system that's happening. As Daria mentioned, I'm also very interested in ice, and I went to the Arctic in 2019, and I'll be returning again, doing a bunch of different things, a lot of 3D scanning, and that's tied to the exhibition. It's an outdoor piece that's up now. It'll be up for a year at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, but that piece is titled Albedo, so it's about reflectance and the warming of our climate. And then I'll be traveling there next summer to continue that research and then dabble in a bunch of other crazy stuff that I'm thinking of still. So
Thank you, Mia.
Thanks.
Thank you. Millie?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daria, for your introduction. And Daria, by the way, has an utterly fascinating practice herself, working with biological processes like mycelium, so check her out.
Thank you, Mia.
And thanks for the segue. Yes, I'm regretful that there's a human rights focused panel on at the same time, because I would be there if I wasn't here. But I don't think we can talk about climate change without also talking about human rights. And in fact, it's necessary to think about both in tandem with one another when speaking about either. So this ties into certainly what has driven my practice for decades now, which is concern with social inequities. I've been raging for a while about the injustices, atrocities that continue to happen across the globe. And so in terms of how that ties in with climate and change, it's certainly about the land. I've been focused on landscape and how that's defined as opposed to land, and the erased histories of the land. So what do we not see when we look at land or landscape? And how do I as an artist convey a compelling presence of the history of that land? And so, we have to consider the ongoing battle over land, who has a right to live on it, occupy it, what can be bled from it, and this is something that is an ongoing problem, obviously. So the way I define land, it's not just limited to terra firma. It's our water, air, our bodies, our communities. So for instance, the current project, one of the current projects I'm working on is called SRS, Silk Road Songbook. And it's in collaboration with Arzu Özkal, who is a San Diego-based artist of Turkish descent. And we've chosen this major route over Eurasia that kind of bookend our ancestries, so from Istanbul to Xi'an, and so places in between. It's an audio-video project, and we're weaving songs of descent into the land, broadcasting women's distinct, we call unruly voices, on this ancient Eurasian migration route. The songs are about land, self-determination, cultural identity, and we're working in collaboration with different groups, musicians in and near Istanbul and Tehran, Tashkent, Bishkek, and Xi'an. So we're trying to convey through their song making their own complex stories that come out of place and are rooted in place and rooted in land, and trying to challenge an Orientalist exoticism, cultural tourism, and certainly censorship. I mean, this is authoritarian regimes they're having to work under. And part of this is to try and disrupt the clean, tidy narrative of Silk Road, and they select the landscape, they select the musical genre, the lyrical content. So for each place, women's voices are the dynamic driving force, and the land is the visual anchor. So I just want to read a couple of quotes here, or a quote here, and mention some scholars that are interesting in this context. So cultural historian Michael Denning states, quote, the decolonization of the ear made possible the decolonization of the territory, end quote. So SRS is informed by also historians of the Silk Road, for instance, Valerie Hansen and Peter Frankopan, and it was stunning for me to learn that the Silk Road is not built by these large caravans that travel through with multiple camels. It was actually formed in a very humble way by migrants and refugees. And so if you think about what we're dealing with now, and in terms of the mass migration, the growing migration, increasing migration of peoples across the globe, what's changed? Not much, So priding ourselves on progress, and meanwhile the growth of the intensification of authoritarian and expansion of authoritarian regimes, intolerance, hatred, war. These are what we're dealing with now. So certainly this is vital to keep in the conversation whenever talking about climate change. So,
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I should have read that earlier.
I feel like these microphones are so intimidating. So, Millie, thank you so much for this. Actually, this is so interesting because when I look at you, when I was researching the bios of the presenters, most of you I actually do know already. In terms of I was, intersecting together through some research that I've done. But the project that you're talking about is actually I haven't read anything about this. So thank you for sharing this. Maybe I was looking in the wrong places, but I also wanted to remind. Thank you everyone, by the way, for this really interesting remarks about in some summary of your practice. So I also want to remind people that if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and our producer is going to be able to come to you and you can write it down. So we don't have very much time, but we have enough time, and we want to allocate enough time for you guys to be able to, because this is for you. So. And we want to know what you're thinking, what are the questions you're asking. So to start this discussion, I prepared my own question, and while everybody was talking, I realized some of this question was already answered, a part of it. So that was interesting. So I thought maybe going a little bit more personal and asking the moderators, like, how is the personal involvement? How do you feel personally? How is your work changing when you are personally becoming involved in the materials or processes or ideas or other communities that you're working with? So is it fueling your practice further? Like, what are the emotions that are, because I think when we talk a lot about art and science collaborations, the artist is the person who is bringing, and especially memory, emotion, feeling to the audience, right? To actually connect to the audience. So I wanted to see if the panelists would like to just briefly elaborate on that, because some of you already touched on that. So, and it could be both emotions. Yeah, it could be negative and positive. Like, what are you encountering there when you're working on this project? Please, Jeffrey, you can definitely start.
Yeah. So this string quartet that I was telling you about, again, about this tree on Vancouver Island, and working on that piece of music has been different from any other piece that I've ever written. In many ways, it has vast passages of music that are completely new for me, and it is in direct answer to your question, because as I was thinking about the kinds of things I wanted to express in this piece, I had to explore new creative parts of myself, and I had to allow those parts to speak, even if it was something that traditionally I might look at that and say, oh no, I can't have, for instance, this very long passage of very, very static, still music. That's unlike anything I've ever composed before, but it was appropriate for the piece that I was writing. And so that's one way. It's just opened up my expressive palette by really contemplating things of great importance, but also things that exist on different time scales and different kinds of sensibilities than perhaps I'm used to thinking about. The other big thing, you touched on it, Aaron, is this idea of not wanting to contribute to climate despair, right? This feeling of, if we feel completely hopeless about the situation, then hopelessness breeds helplessness, right? And if our goal is to provoke action on the part of our listeners or our audience, then we have to think about that in a very active way. And this string quartet originally was going to end in a very, very emphatic, kind of angry way, with using some of these pictures that have been taken by the photographer T.J. Watt on Vancouver Island. And these are before-after pictures. He will go into groves with 1,000-year-old trees and photograph them, and then he will hear that maybe that tract was logged, and he will go back and he will take a picture of the stump, and he put these side by side. These are very arresting, disturbing images. And originally that was the way it was going to end, because I was so angry and I wanted to make this visceral kind of, sort of fist pounding kind of response to the situation. And then I realized that that was not the way the piece should end, that would not help anything. It would just contribute to more frustration. And I thought, you know what, I have to figure out some way to get from that place to a place of healing and hopefully empowerment. And I think those things are things that the arts can do uniquely well. And so that was another thing that I think I'm still processing in my own work about what do I want to leave the audience with? And I want to hopefully leave them with a sense of possibility and empowerment.
Thank you so much for this response, Erin.
I'll just chime in very briefly here to say that I really believe that we shouldn't perpetuate any stereotypes of divisions of feeling between scientists and art. I mean, every scientist I have worked with is deeply concerned, so knowledgeable and deeply concerned about what's happening to the environment, and they feel it deeply and they express it to me very deeply. And so Yeah, I think we all are in this, and we all have different strengths in terms of expression and communication and what we know. And I just take a great pleasure in being able to work with, collaborate with scientists, and find them highly expressive as well. And yeah, I wanted to kind of say that I think that we all have ways of being quite creative, and that's been a great pleasure for me.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, this is an excellent remark, by the way, just because a lot of times people would consider, well, there is a division between an art and science mind, but there is none, because it's a fluid entity that feeds upon each other. Yeah. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, of course. So, Mia?
I kind of went off. Thanks. So my relationship, it's interesting, working with scientists and digging into the research. You know, sometimes I do get overwhelmed. I am a ceramic artist. I have a certain carbon footprint, so I really do think a lot about my role in that, the materials I use, and that has led me to new work, thinking about new materials and new ways of working. But, you know, even sometimes I question, you know, should I be going to the Arctic and making that work, and, you know, weighing the balance of my contribution to that conversation about the world and the art and science kind of all together, and then my footprint within that. So, you know, that's something I've been thinking about, I think, a lot lately. But, you know, it's also kind of a source of just amazing inspiration. I mean, you know, working with scientists and kind of, you know, I spoke about wonder a little bit. You know, I'm just every little thing, you know, we're digging deeper, we're asking those questions, and we're suddenly discovering more. And that's just something that fuels my practice. Like, I just don't have enough time to do what I want to do and learn what I want. I have like 50,000 more ideas than I have the time and space to work with. And so it's exciting and scary kind of simultaneously. And so I'm always kind of shifting my modes and feelings about that and trying to, you know, work within that space.
Thank you, Mia. This is also, again, another, just wanted to follow up on this. Some people, we don't, it's a good practice to actually question how the work is delivered, how it is a process, and I love the fact that you touched upon that as a part of this ongoing battle that I experience all the time. And I'm sure a lot of, especially the artists who work in the intersection of art, science, and climate change, I think it's like important for them to be able to analyze their work critically, right, through the prism of carbon footprint, etc. But again, we always have to consider what's going, like, where are we going this, where this is going to, what kind of impact this work is going to make. Thank you so much on that, like, really appreciate it. And Millie.
It's just to follow up on what's been said. I mean, it is full of ironies in terms of what we do as makers, putting things out in the world, using materials, traveling in order to make our work, traveling to the conference. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, of course, that crossed many of our minds, of course. Why aren't we doing this on Zoom? But then that's its own carbon footprint, digital carbon footprint. It's very heavy as well. So what do we do? You know, so yeah, these are all very complicated questions. I guess, you know, in terms of the multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary endeavors, for instance, science, art, or music and visual art, or film, video, I think it's the listening is the most important thing, and being humble enough that you are able to listen and not stay in your silo. That's a big challenge. And you know, so for instance, this current project, I had certain things, social, political agendas I wanted to tackle, and this just wasn't happening. And so it was our collaborators informing us, you know, just in terms of what they needed to do, and where I thought I was doing this for them, you know, this agenda I had at one point, it just was not going to work out without, you know, endangering a lot of, well, not the project per se, but individuals. And then, anyway, it's always a very nuanced, sensitive, complicated negotiation, no matter what it is you are dealing with and what discipline you're working in and what materials you're working with. Ironically, because of the lockdowns, we did all the productions remote, so we remote directed everything. And it was a happy thing in the end because we weren't there to get in their hair. They just did their own thing. We weren't like these visible like outsiders interrupting and bringing attention to what they were doing. And so there were these aspects of, you know, this virus actually, in that way, it was, as I said, ironically, informing us of all of us, probably making us aware, bringing a certain wisdom, or, you know, just stopping us in our tracks. And, you know, so not needing a virus to do that. How do we do that? We need to self-direct as a society and as individuals going forward.
Millie, thank you so much. This was such a well-rounded kind of like the collision of all the information we just received from everyone. So this was like a great conclusion. Thank you so much. So I we have questions. Excellent. If you have more, please raise your hand. And I'm keeping an eye on the audience so I can direct note cards towards your way. So the first question is question actually for Jeffrey and Millie. And the question is, how do you incorporate environmental consciousness into music?
Great question.
I knew
So I'm trying to answer this in a way that's not going to be technical in terms of music, but there's a term in classical music called programmatic music. It's music that tells a story of some kind. And then there is this other term called absolute music, which is a terrible term, but it is a term that is not expressly telling a story. My music is somewhere in between those things. And since that symphony that I talked about in my opening remarks, my music has become progressively more programmatic. I am trying to tell some kind of story. And in the case of Big Lonely Doug, the Douglas fir, it really is a story of his life, really, in a way, and using that as a template for larger subjects. How do I do that musically? I cannot do it in a vacuum. I cannot do it with just the notes. If I played this piece of music for you without any title, any context, any visual cues, anything, you might think it was a nice piece, but you wouldn't say, oh, that must be about a tree on Vancouver Island, right? You wouldn't make that connection. So that's where these other elements, and we touched on the getting out of our silos and using other media, that's exactly what's required here. So in this piece, I used images, the before-after images that I was just talking about a minute ago, and also some recordings of oral histories of people sharing their memories of trees from childhood or trees that were important to them or their community. And all of those things are woven into the whole so that I'm giving the audience something to grab onto. That's I think the unique challenge of music, that, you know, in visual art, we can show what it is that we're talking about, right? And in music by itself, we really can't do that. But if we do give the audience some of these cues, then they can interact with the material in a unique way. And so that's what I'm always striving to do for my pieces. And part of the answer is that as a creator, I have to constantly be thinking about how I want my audience to experience the thing that I'm creating. And a lot of artists may have this attitude of, exclusion all of us here, not anybody here, but many artists are sort of like, well, I'm going to create what I want to create, and basically, you know, I don't care what you people react to or what you experience, you know. And And there are composers who still feel that way. I adamantly do not feel that way. I think that is an abdication of my responsibility, which is to use my artistic voice to engage other people. And so I'm constantly thinking about, how is the audience going to hear this? How is the audience going to experience this? And what can I do to help them along on this journey? And it almost always involves other media as well.
Thank you, Jeffrey, very much. And Millie?
It's a good question because there is so much more theorization of the visual. We are an ocular-centric society. I mean, the world is ocular-centric. You know, these things help that. And so to be able to analyze sound or to realize what you're listening to, I mean, sound is really powerful in that way because it can cut through and reach your gut much quicker. But then it's hard to interpret it in that way, and then how do you deliver content? And so, for instance, with this SRS project, we decided that because the landscape, the land is the dominant visual, and so we didn't want to make music videos. So the people, the performers are tiny figures in the midground of this huge land. And we had a mic for each musician, but we also have a mic for the environment. And so the environment gets its own mic. And so this is the sound that ties all the landscapes. There are 5 places we worked with, and this is the sound that ties all of these places together. So you're hearing birds and, on occasion, 4-legged animals, and the wind, and insects, lots of insects. You're hearing this throughout, and that's certainly part of the audio. That is part of the songs, the music.
Millie, thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you for the question. This was very... So I'm trying to read the name of the state college because I want to credit the person from State College in Nebraska, and I just can't read that. I think it says... What do you think, Jeffrey?
It looks like Peru State College. Peru
State College, yeah. So, okay. Thank you for that question. Thank you so much. I want to give a credit to that. So it's interesting how we actually have this influx of questions that I want to continue with that sort of tie things together. So, and this is the question for all the panelists, but I want to start with Mia and follow up with Erin. So as a student, this is the question. I am concerned about misrepresentation and misinterpretation. How do you address the concern that your works may be misused by others, or may people sometimes cannot, or something you don't intend misrepresent? So Mia, maybe you want to clarify on that?
I guess.
Did it ever happen to you?
It hasn't happened to me. So,
okay.
I speak, a lot of my work comes with a lot of writing that's somewhat fact-based. There's always, like, if you look at my website, there's a lot of kind of more scientifically written than kind of just my expressive emotions about something. So, I think I present my work with kind of a certain amount of knowledge behind it, I guess. So I don't think that's come up yet.
Well, that's also a good, it hasn't come up, so it hasn't come up.
I mean, I think sometimes people go, oh, look, it's blue.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe missing the point where they're just looking as like that art should just be expressive.
Exactly.
And that it's just about being beautiful or attractive or where would they put it in their house kind of thing. That isn't something I think about with my work. And, I try to always have enough to draw a viewer in, obviously, but then also kind of give something else back in maybe a different way. So.
Thank you for that. I mean, again, it's interesting to see how different, how our panelists actually possibly haven't encountered this yet, but if they did, what actually happened? What do you think about this, Erin?
Yeah, I also feel that when I put something out in the world, I don't quite know where it will go, and can't control that, and don't have any thoughts that I would try to. But that's my personal the way that I work. And so I'm trying to also read between the lines of that question a little bit and think about the fears of putting something out into the world and how there is so much negativity and so many ways that facts can become misrepresented if taken and twisted. And so I guess I just want to fight against that fear and put things out into the world that I believe in and that I have made with care and thought, and trust that the world will also have enough people out there who will take it in trust and confidence and be inspired by it and try to press down those fears. So I would encourage that person to make work and to put things out there and not let the fear prevent them from doing that.
Thank you for that.
Could I just add one thing real quickly? I think one of the hardest things about being an artist, at least for me, I don't know if my colleagues agree, but is that experience of sort of releasing something out there in the world, at which point you no longer have control over how people will react to it or what will happen to it. I've had people come up to me after a performance of any number of pieces and say, well, this is what I felt. Is that the right reaction? You know, and it's not my business to say this is what you must experience from my work. I want everyone to have their own unique experience. When we did the tour of For the Trees in the high schools last week, one of the questions I asked afterwards was, I said, okay, when we got to those before-after pictures of the logging, how many of you felt angry? And about a third of the students raised their hands. I said, how many of you felt sad? And about a third of the students raised their hands. And I said, how many of you felt resolved to do something? And, you know, and the remaining students raised their hands. And I loved the fact that there was that range of responses, and they were all legitimate. And what each person does with that, of course, is not out of my control, but I've hopefully, you know, sort of lit the fuse on something positive. And after that, it's out of my hands.
Thank you so much. And Mila, do you want to follow up?
I just thought of an Eldridge Cleaver quote. Too much agreement kills a chat.
Oh, nice. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. So we have, again, so the next question, I'm trying to figure out how to follow this discussion with the questions, you know, to story. And so do you find your work becoming more interdisciplinary to create or affect the viewer or listener? And I think a lot of you already kind of answered that question, but if you want to follow up, maybe something specific, you know, so that would be interesting too. And again, this is for every panelist, and we can go in the same direction. We'll start with Jeffrey, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes.
Of course, yes.
But I think I'll add one aspect to it, that when we tend to think of interdisciplinarity, we tend to think of, you know, music and science, or music and photographs and oral history, or whatever, and that's obviously a part of it. But the other piece that I'd like to bring up here is the way we can partner with other organizations in our community. So that was a big part of this string quartet, was this idea that the conversation with the audience would be guided by local environmental organizations, representatives, activists, people who could first answer questions about deforestation right here in our own backyard, wherever the piece is being played, but also, you know, share resources about what are we doing in this area? How can you be involved? And that partnering with these other organizations also has a very practical impact, which is that it gets more people to come to the show, right? Because they have their mailing lists and they have their networks. And so it becomes a much more integrated community experience. And it's one of the things that I talk with my students about all the time, that partnerships are one of the most important, powerful ways that we can use to get our art out into the world and have an impact. Don't do it in just this own little artistic bubble of a museum or a music performance space. Connect it with these other organizations, and you amplify the impact tremendously. So that's sort of another kind of an interdisciplinary way of looking at it, I guess, in a slightly different sense. But
Thank you. And Ari or Mia? I feel like your work is already interdisciplinary in its sense, right? So, and so if you want to follow up in a way, maybe there's something recently that became more apparent, like the way the direction it's taking.
I guess I view it as kind of community building
Mm-hmm.
in a different way. You know, taking risks sometimes. I mean, I'm working on a project that suddenly I'm in it. You know, I really shy away from anything that involves kind of more people, you know, human relationships. I prefer, you know, really remote landscapes that are devoid of people and kind of thinking of our little tiny sliver in this bigger system. But, you know, I'm doing a project now which I'm in it a little bit, not my face but my body, and I'm incorporating sound, and I'm realizing I'm having to kind of reach out, and I'm thinking more about, you know, the land that I'm on in a different way, because I am thinking more about kind of a current level of communication. So it's called the mobility of geology. It's kind of brand new and scary.
Well, this is excellent because we do have a question about the future projects, which I reserved for the end, but we can just totally be spontaneous. Yeah.
I do have a follow-up thought on that, which is that I do think that where we are right now in terms of climate, there is a heightening of our awareness of how connected everything is. So, I mean, think back to the 1970s and Lovelock and Lynn Margulis's idea of the Gaia theory and the interconnectedness of the planet. We're all aware of that. But I think as we get farther and farther along, and the pandemic certainly heightened this as well, but this understanding that countries, communities are never in isolation. Planetarily, we are more connected than ever. Things can travel so rapidly, whether that's information or an invasive species or a bacteria, what have you. Everything is moving and is so much more fluid than it was 10 or 20 or 50 years ago, and certainly a millennia ago. So in that sense, from the perspective of making work, I think it's really difficult to look at anything in isolation. I mean, you have to just know that that's what you're doing. Okay, I'm taking an empirical look. I'm pointing my microscope here, and I'm looking. But understanding that actually, if I'm thinking about the Silk Road, that of course connects to a plethora of other things. Or if I'm thinking about the Arctic, or if I'm thinking about trees, how does that then connect to the mycorrhiza and the insects, and then all of the species of birds that are dependent on those? And you know, that kind of multitude, it's always been there, but I do think it's exacerbated at this moment in time with climate connectivity and crises, and you know, thinking about the way that pollution is again a global effect. If it's created in one place, it affects the entire world. So that, again, I don't want to put it in an academic sphere of necessarily interdisciplinarity, but I'm interested in it in that global perspective of connectivity, and how do we show that or think about it.
Thank you, Erin, for this interest. I mean, interconnectivity becomes your interdisciplinary kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes like this next thing. And Millie, do you have anything maybe to add to this?
Listening to the rest of you brought to mind that, you know, in terms of, and just following up on what I was saying earlier about listening, and I mean, what's of interest to me, and certainly in terms of trying to figure out how do we go forward and fix things and pay better attention. And I don't know if there's a word for it, but if it's not, it would be, you know, be trans-species interdisciplinary. I don't know if there's a word for it. Just shout it out if anyone knows the word for it. But you know, because listening to researchers who are trying to study the language, and I don't know if we should call it language, but that's very human-centric, but language of whales, for instance, or how insects operate, you know, their social structure, and or what ice sounds like. I mean, the what we consider sentient or non-sentient. You know, what do we know? I always think of the that that pulsating rock in the early Star Trek. It's a sentient rock. But all of these possibilities that, I mean, our arrogance disallows us to entertain, and so we have rarely gone down those paths. And so to be open to that, I think, is a really important, those are important forays going into the future, I think. Or your work with mycelium, for instance.
It's interesting because you're kind of touching upon this question of agency right here to follow up. And the thing is, like, if we're working with this, non-human agents, right? So how do we know that there is a consent? I believe you're the one who was asking me that question a couple, like 4 or 5 years ago when we're talking about the collaboration and the nature of that, right? And you were asking, well, Daria, what is collaboration means consent? How do you get the consent from non-human agents? Because the language is how do we communicate and get the consent? So this is an interesting follow-up on that, just kind of like my personal overview what everyone is talking. So I have a couple more questions, and we have some time, not that much, about 10 minutes, but I wanted to, there's a quick one for Erin. Where at DMNS is your artwork displayed? So I just thought, like, just
sure.
a quick
Very
one.
quickly,
Yeah.
if you go up to the second floor, take a left. It's in the exhibition there, right on the left of the second floor.
Thank you. And so there is another one which we already sort of touched upon that, but I still want to give, maybe we can elaborate a little bit. How do you reduce your carbon footprint while making your various art forms? So this also could be going to all the panelists, because a lot of 3 of you guys are working with materials, right? So maybe Erin wanted to?
Yeah, I can chime in really
course,
quickly with that too. I think about this all the time, and we're all complicit, and we all are drawing upon resources at any given moment. And how do you mitigate that? Certainly, films are particularly pernicious if they have giant crews and if they are parachuting in and traveling the globe with a lot of equipment and a lot of people in tow. So I personally really appreciate using archival footage and found footage and existing work and pulling on that when I can. I feel like that's increasingly important. Everyone has a camera on their phone. I am not a purist and technological elitist. I really think I can work with a lot of different things, and I'm grateful to collaborate with people and share images, and that's what we have in the world. So it's pretty easy to do that. And again, coming back to the idea of arrogance, it can be pretty arrogant if an artist thinks, well, I'm the only one who can do that. And you know what? Actually, if you get a little creative, there's a lot of material out there, and I think you might be able to express yourself without producing as much of a carbon footprint as you might.
Thank you, Erin. Mia?
Yeah, that's a big one.
I know, it's a very pressing one.
With my, ceramic materials, they aren't the reason that extraction exists. They are kind of a byproduct of tons of other things, but, my materials come from the earth. So I think I try to educate myself a lot, thinking about, where do these things come from? And there's a big movement in the ceramics community to really kind of identify, and, some of that is invisible to us. And so really trying to find those lines of where something goes or where it comes from. And then I'm fortunate enough to have a really kind of state-of-the-art kiln that I was able to get. And so although I do sometimes fire with a gas kiln, it's a very fancy special one that but it's very, very efficient. It's very fast, and I've been charting that and comparing that. The EPA has a great site where I can compare kilowatt hours to cubic feet of gas, and I can, so it's not just like, oh, electric's better. Well, electric burns coal a lot of the time. Predominantly, the majority in Colorado is still coal. And so, I can compare, and I can, at least make thoughtful choices. And I try to teach that to my students. That's really an integral part of, the studio classes that I teach, and that knowledge, and hopefully passing that along, that you're just educated and thoughtful. I was just at a talk last night, Calliope Mononoyos, who talks about plastics. And, sometimes it's things you don't even think have this long line, and we just think, oh, Q-tips, whatever, or floss, and it's figuring out, on the surface something can be a better choice, but educating yourself about what really is and doing the best we can, really.
Thank you so much. Excellent. And Millie, want to?
A long time ago, and a collaborator, Evelyn von Mikulovsky, who I worked on a lot on performance-based work. And the reason why we turned to that is because two of us made us braver, but mostly to do performance-based, like public space work, but mostly it was driven by just the not wanting to put more stuff out in the world. Not that I don't still make objects, and there's footprint made with producing video, and even audio. That's remote communications, etc. You can't get away. You really can't get away from it. But that was the impetus, was wanting to stop putting more stuff out in the world. It's an important consideration, I think, as makers, in terms of what kind of materials we use and the processes, and creativity is always going to surface. And I think it's interesting to think about, well, what are ways to do it without using new resources? I think it is a really important consideration. I really appreciate what the Situationists International said in terms of originality, because when I was a student, it was all about making original work, and now I try to teach students not to sweat it. In fact, it's very liberating to not think about having to make original work, and that because it's all out there already, it's circulating, it's all already existing, and it's a matter of you're just kind of reaching like into a fruit tree, and here's this fruit, it's already out there, and then you do something with that. And so it's just a matter of turning your thinking in that way. And certainly, yes, it's climate impact is totally relevant to creativity in that way.
Thank you, Millie. And Jeffrey, do you want to follow up real briefly on this?
Yeah, just you mentioning creativity. So one of the things that came up for me when I was first doing the first performance of the string quartet was I want to direct people to resources. I want to direct them to more about Big Lonely Doug's story and so forth, but I'm not going to print a concert program on paper at a concert about not cutting trees down. That doesn't make any sense. So I thought, what the heck am I going to do? And we ended up deciding that we could get some of that paper that's made out of flower seeds. Have you heard of this thing? And I would put a QR code on that, and they had cards that were shaped like little leaves, which was perfect. And so we printed a QR code, we made a dedicated web page, and then everybody got a little seed paper that they could scan the QR code and then plant it in their garden and have wildflowers come up from it. So, I think that's another kind of the way that creativity can sort of turn this problem into an opportunity.
Well, this is, just, speaking to my heart about this. So again, I think the key takeaway from this conversation is awareness and research, and this requires a lot of work, sometimes more than the actual production of the work, so that's I feel sometimes about. And I think because we kind of always, we used to so much abundance around us, so we think, okay, we just throw this away and get another thing and another thing and another thing. And I think this is like a good way of examining the practice with all of you just described in that sense. So we have time, about literally 4 minutes, for the last question that I saved. And a lot of you sort of touched upon this, but this was the question: what does each artist feel as the most pressing environment issue currently, and can they talk a little bit about future projects? So the future project they are considering to express this. So this is kind of just like a summary of everything. So 1 minute, sorry, for each person. And whoever wants to start. I'm like, well, okay. I mean, Mia, you touched upon the project that you're working on, right?
Yeah, I guess the directions I'm going is because I have some upcoming travel, and it's always, I work in big sculptural objects. How can I get there with these objects? How can I work in the way I want to work in the Arctic, and planes, trains, and automobiles to get there? So I'm personally investigating, sound, as Millie kind of talked about, the act of listening and that non-human communication. And that ties to even like dendrochronology and these libraries of information that we collect for future, because we don't know how to interpret what is being communicated yet. But yeah, sound and even movement, things like that. So kind of new modes, and I don't know, plastic scares me the most, I think. And with these new directions I'm going, I always liked that I don't really use plastic very much, and then these new areas that I'm going into, it's plastic. So it's interesting, but I think that's one of the biggest things that I think about for us and our children. It's everywhere.
Thank you. Erin?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I would say I did make a film about these incredible mealworms that can biodegrade plastics. Mm-hmm. So, and there are some really hopeful things about like plastic degradation with bacteria and other species. But I think plastics are awful too. I mean, there's like a litany of worries, of course, ahead of us. I think I might choose under pressure here that getting out of fossil fuels seems just immediate. I mean, because of the implications of the ways in which that's affecting so many kind of weather patterns, and then all the people that will be dependent upon that, and the inequitable ways in which people will be affected by these natural disasters that will come out of increasing temperatures and increasing uncertainty of global weather. So I don't have any projects necessarily speaking kind of to that really large picture, because it is so huge. But something that, because I live in Colorado and I'm thinking about the Mountain West all the time, certainly drought and wildfire have played a role in my personal life and my personal art practice. And so I have some pieces I'm working on in the future that relate specifically to the ways in which wildfire affect us. A lot of artists are working in that realm as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think what I would say is it's not quite such a linear process for me, and I suspect it may be true for the rest of us here, where this idea of, okay, this is the thing I think is most important, so I'm going to create something about that. To me, it's very much the reverse, asking myself, how can the things that percolate in my artistic voice speak to an issue of importance? So, and I've learned over the years that I need a long time for ideas to sort of brew and marinate in my head before I'm willing to and ready to give them expression. So, I think that one of the issues that I've been thinking about a lot is how climate change is causing the oceans to warm, acidification of the oceans, lack of circulation as a result of warming ocean waters. I think about that a lot, and I think it's a result of all of the degradations that we're doing, but it's a huge problem. But I have no idea how I might address that artistically. But then someday maybe it will, and something will spark in my mind, and I'll say, I think I want to explore that artistically. So I think it's not so linear, I guess I would say.
And so, Millie?
Yeah, I concur with that state of being. I mean, the SRS project we've been working on since 2016, 2017. I haven't been able to, get my head around beyond that. I'm just so zeroed in on just trying to complete this project. So I don't know. I'll continue to make audio-visual projects because they're of interest to me. But I'm actually dying to work on a set of new drawings, which will be very contemplative, dealing with similar issues, but just very humble, drawing on paper. Really looking forward to it. I can do it on my kitchen table.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for your questions and for your participation. This was excellent. We covered all the questions. That's like never happens, you know? So thank you so much.